Hey guys, Brad here from Scooter Street. Today I want to do a video that's probably, honestly, pretty long overdue. It's one I've been wanting to do for quite a while, and that is Piaggio Zip Beast Mode. What are the best mods for the Piaggio Zip? Now to do that, I have my Piaggio Zip just behind me. Now, this bike is not exactly what I would call beast mode. In terms of a street bike, it's pretty close, but at the shop here, we've been sort of tuning and working on these bikes pretty heavily for sort of 11 to 12 years. We've done, with the Piaggio engine, the Hiper2 engine in these, everything you could possibly imagine. We've raced it, we've won 24-hour races in it, we've built literally hundreds of these engines in all different stages and variations of tuning, different parts. And more importantly, we've seen customers' reactions and also the longevity of how these performance upgrades have lasted with time. And there's honestly, I think, a lot of valuable information that we can pass on about this based on that experience, not just this part is the best, but how does it actually fare over time? What's it like to live with? Because some performance upgrades might be higher performance, but they're a real pain to live with. So I'm going to split this up into sort of two sets of two categories. So first off, I'm going to attack the engine. So what are the absolute best engine mods? Now I'm going to split this up into two, same as with our SR50R beast mode. We're going to do absolute top beast mode. What are the best parts that you can possibly put on this bike in terms of performance? And then we're going to do street beast mode. What are the best street upgrades? If you want a bike that's super fun and fast, but also reliable on the street, you're not having to constantly do maintenance, it's not constantly breaking down, constantly need to be retuned. What's the best street version of this bike? And then we're going to attack the chassis in exactly the same way. What are the absolute top highest performing parts that you can put on a Piaggio Zip chassis? And then what are the sort of best street beast mode parts? Now, particularly with the chassis, the street beast mode parts are going to be more around, I guess, economics. So what are the best value for money parts? Because with the chassis, a $2,000 shock is always going to be better than a $200 shock. So with the chassis specifically, it's going to be more around budget. What are the best value for money upgrades that you can make to a Piaggio Zip? Because the more money you spend on the chassis, the better it's going to handle. So the comparison point will be more sort of value for money. These are honestly such a great little bike. Between this and the SR50, they're my two favorite bikes I've ever worked on, ever owned. I've owned multiple of each. I'd honestly probably say I think Zips kind of get it because they're such a fun little chassis, short wheelbase, pop wheelies. They're probably my favorite bike. So I'm actually really excited to share with you guys my experience and what I think honestly makes these bikes, or what can make them, the best, most fun scooter that you can get. Now, starting off with the engine, we're going to begin with the cylinder and exhaust combination. Now, this might seem like a silly order, but your cylinder and your exhaust are sort of the core of the engine in a two-stroke. You choose these, you match them together, and then you sort of build the rest of the engine around it. Now, to start off with, this is an air-cooled Zip. Now, in Australia, we only got the air-cooled Zip 50cc. Over in Europe, there's obviously the Zip SP, which is a liquid-cooled model. That being said, the engine casings between the liquid-cooled and air-cooled model are actually exactly the same. The only difference is on the liquid-cooled, there's a hole for the impeller, for the liquid cooling impeller inside the casing, whereas on the air-cooled model, they've just machined a pin in place. Now, with the liquid-cooled model, the impeller is driven off the oil pump gear, whereas on the air-cooled model, they've put a pin in place where the hole would be, and the oil pump gear just sits on the pin and rotates on that. So it is actually very easy, I know because I've done it, to convert an air-cooled Piaggio Zip to liquid cooling. In fact, you can actually do it with all factory Piaggio parts because the chassis on the air-cooled model actually has all the brackets welded in place to literally just buy the factory Piaggio parts and mount a radiator and all the additional parts to convert it to liquid cooling. The only difference will be because of that pin that has been machined in place where the oil pump gear, where the impeller would normally be, you just need to run an electric pump for your coolant. Very, very easy. And I know because I've done it myself, you can either wire the power for it into the ignition so it runs automatically as soon as you turn the bike on, or you just wire an inline switch, which is simpler, and it's the way I did it. So in terms of cylinder and exhaust combination, converting to liquid cooling is probably going to be the first thing you're going to want to do for an absolute beast mode. Now, when it comes to, once we get to that point, selecting your cylinder, you've got a couple of different options. So in this particular bike, I've got a single ring Velocity kit. They do this kit in liquid cooled version as well. In the liquid cooled, you're going to get more power because you lose a lot with the air cooled fan, and it also runs cooler with liquid cooling as well. So you just get that extra advantage, hence why that liquid cooled upgrade is definitely going to be worth it. So if you didn't want to do that, you could just run what I'm running here, or preferably you would go towards the liquid cooling kit. Now you can go for one of the single ring 70cc, high-end kits, or ideally you're going to go for the Testarossa cylinder or 94cc cylinder kit that is designed to fit the factory engine casings. Now, once you choose this kit, some of the other options become quite easy because you only have one option. Now, as it pertains to the 94cc Testarossa, you must run a particular MHR racing exhaust with that kit. And you also have to use a particular crank with that kit because it increases the stroke. So it kind of makes the rest of the engine choices quite simple. Now, in terms of intake from that point forward, you're going to run probably maybe a 28mm carb. There is actually a recommendation from Malossi in the Testarossa kit of what size carb to run, but you're going to run probably a PWK or some similar, 28mm or larger carb for that sort of setup, just because the fuel and air demands of that 94cc absolute beast of a Bridgeport cylinder kit are immense. So you need to increase the size of the carb to suit. You've got to remember, 94cc is nearly double the factory displacement, and the factory carb is already 17.5. So running, a 28mm or 30 or more carb is it's what you need. It's what the engine actually needs to be able to run properly. Now, going along with that, you're obviously also going to need to run a pod filter to go with the air demands of the engine. So cylinder, crank, exhaust, carb, and air intake are all sorted. The things that are left are the engine's electrical system and the transmission. So I'll start off with the electrical system because that's a bit simpler. You're going to need to run an inner rotor. There's just no other option. Inner rotor is where it's at. This engine will not run properly unless you have an inner rotor. The factory flywheel is just simply too heavy. Now, with these higher end racing cylinder kits, they make a lot of power up top, but it comes at the sacrifice of low down torque. So the engine needs to rev really, really hard to make that power because it's all up the top. Now, if you run a factory stator and flywheel, on top of not having as much spark as an inner rotor, it's too much resistance at that low end, too much rotational mass to have to try and spin up to get up to those higher RPMs for the engine to really have that off the mark kick. It's going to be really boggy and awful down low until you get up to those higher RPMs. These high power cylinder kits, what they want is minimal resistance. They want to be able to rev from a low RPM up to a high RPM very rapidly. And the only way you're going to be able to do that is with an inner rotor ignition. Now, the other thing is an inner rotor ignition gives you a lot more control of your spark and electrical system. So, for instance, the Malossi Team 2 inner rotor that I have in this bike, the CDI just from the Malossi factory, the Digitronic CDI, has lots of adjustments in terms of timing, either advancing and retarding the timing, different map modes as well. Different cylinder kits, particularly the Testarossa, require particular mapping modes to run properly. Now, the mapping modes on these, essentially what they do is they advance and retard the timing to different levels depending on where the engine is in its RPM. So at different RPMs, it will advance or retard the timing to get the optimal performance out of it. Malossi know what they're doing. When they build these cylinder kits, which are incredibly highly machined and really at the edge of what's possible from these small displacement two-stroke engines, they're really doing the work and they know what they're doing. So these are the recommended parts they tell you to run, like the Team 2 inner rotor. And these mapping modes are there for a reason. So if you're spending the money, the best thing to do is just buy the right parts. And again, if you're going to be running a Testarossa, the Malossi Team 2 inner rotor is really the only inner rotor that's going to have that mapping mode in it, which specifically is designed for the Testarossa cylinder kit. Now, even with the lower level cylinder kits, if you go for the Testarossa 70 or a lower level single ring 70 kit, they still have mapping modes in there specifically to those kits. So it just makes it easy. Now, when it comes to a transmission, I know this is kind of sounding like we're sort of the Malossi show here, and we are big fans of Malossi at the shop here, just from our experience over the years. When we come to a transmission, although I would recommend the MHR overrange transmission, either the full billet aluminium kit or the lesser kit, which is what I actually have in this bike, I would not recommend the Malossi clutch. I'm not a big fan of the Fly or the Delta. The They don't really do anything for me. We've used them many times over the years. However, for the same money, the Polini G3, I think, is a better clutch. And it will work with the Malossi transmission. The reason I'd recommend the G3 is because it has adjustability within the different springs. So you can put a stiffer spring set in the clutch, but then it also has quite a bit of adjustment via little adjusting grub screws that tension the spring further within those different springs, which is honestly awesome for tunability. You have virtually unlimited tunability with the G3, and you just don't really have that with the Fly. The Delta has some adjustability, but it's a bit of a pain to adjust, whereas the Polini is honestly really easy and quite intuitive to adjust. Now, coming to our street beast mode, this is honestly going to be pretty easy because we've done this exact setup so many times over the years. There's very little variation between it. And that is MHR replica cylinder kit and Yasuni R. This cylinder and exhaust combination is honestly just a match made in heaven. They work so well together. They're so torquey, they're reliable. You get like 20,000 Ks out of it between piston changes. And it's really easy to tune because they're well matched. They just work. There's no mucking around, there's no finickiness. This setup is just tried and proven and tested so many times. We've done this setup over the years. It just works and you won't be disappointed. One of the things that makes this particular cylinder kit so great, the MHR replica, is it's not just a standard port map, it's what they call a 9-port map. So it's got a couple of additional exhaust ports which give you a bit more power and torque, but it's also a twin ring piston. We've got a couple of pistons here. So this is a typical 70cc race piston. See, it's got a single ring and it's a very, very small ring. So it's less resistance against the cylinder wall. It's going to give you generally more power. This is a twin ring piston. This is actually out of an MHR replica cylinder kit. Now, you'll see straight away that the rings are thicker, but there's also 2 of them. This is going to give you less blow-by, but also more longevity over the years, because you've got 2 rings pushing against the cylinder, stopping blow-by and stopping gumming up of those rings. It's going to give you just that longer time frame between having to do piston changes. But the big key with that cylinder kit is it kind of sits in a bit of a middle ground between a street and a race cylinder kit, in that it's got a very similar port map to a street cylinder kit, but because of those 2 additional exhaust ports, it gives you sort of somewhere between the exhaust gas flow of a normal sport cylinder kit and a racing kit which uses a Bridgeport. Now, Bridgeport cylinder kits, like I mentioned, generally need piston changes a lot more regularly. So you're getting kind of a bit closer to race level performance, but still with that street level reliability and longevity. Now, moving up to the intake, the carb and sort of air filter setup that we found works really, really well with this particular setup over the years is a either Malossi kit or Delorto PHBG21. Now, you can go with the 19, but really the 21 is the better upgrade because you're increasing the displacement of the cylinder kit from 50 to 70 by almost 50%. So going from a 17.5mm factory carb up to a 19, it's just not really enough to equate for that difference. The 21mm carb is a much better option. Now, one of the sort of small annoyances with the PHBG21 is that it's a manual choke carb only. Now, if you're really upset by this, you can go with the PHVB22. The advantage being that it's pretty much the big brother of the PHVA 17.5 that comes in these bikes from factory. So you can still run exactly the same auto choke setup that comes from factory. It actually runs the exact same auto choke as the factory carb. In fact, if you put a PHVA next to a PHVB, they look like identical carbs, just the PHVB is just that little bit bigger. Now, the downside, or I guess the comparison point between a PHBG and a PHVB, they're pretty similar size. The big difference is tunability. Now, the PHBG gives you such a wide array of fine tunability. You can get full needle kits for it with many, many needles in it, pilot jet kits, main jet kits that are all really readily accessible and easy to change. The PHVB is a bit of a different story. Now, there's an argument to be made that it doesn't require as much tunability because it's really closer to a factory carb. It's not really designed as a performance carb. But when you want those additional levels of tunability, it's just not really there. It's a pain to get different needle kits and pilot jet kits for it in different parts, whereas the PHBG is just a performance platform. It is built for this type of setup. All the parts are super readily accessible. It's easy to tune. And honestly, it responds really well to this particular cylinder and exhaust setup. Now, when it comes to air filters, yes, with this setup, you could run a pod filter, but I would not recommend it. The reason being, unless you're running a Bridgeport cylinder kit, the bike just does not demand that much air. With performance, you're just not going to see a significant performance increase between running a standard airbox and a pod filter with this cylinder and exhaust setup. In fact, I would probably go to say, from my experience over the years, you're going to get better performance from a factory airbox with a couple of opened up holes, maybe using some Molossi air stuffers that come in that Molossi carb kit with the PHBG. You're going to get better performance with a factory airbox and a couple of airbox stuffers than you are with a pod filter. The other factor is the pod filter is going to make it a lot less reliable. I know, because I'm running one on this and it's a real pain. The only reason I'm running one on this is because I have a single ring cylinder in this bike. If you're running an MHR rep, there's just no need to run a pod filter. Now, if you want the sound from the pod filter, because it does admittedly have a really nice raspy intake sound, by all means, but you're not going to be doing it for performance, because there's just not really an advantage. In fact, I'd say there's a lot of convenience disadvantage to running a pod filter. Now, coming to our engine electrical componentry, there's a bit of a misconception about the factory stator CDI setup in the factory Piaggio engine. A lot of guys rush out to buy a Molossi TC unit or an unrestricted CDI. With a Molossi MHR replica cylinder kit, this is absolutely unnecessary. Now, the factory CDI electrical setup in the Piaggio engine has a rev limiter at 11,000 RPM. An MHR replica cylinder kit is not physically capable of hitting this. We've done this upgrade against our advice for customers many times over the years and seen absolutely zero performance increase. Nothing. Now, these customers had every other part that I've just listed. They put the TC unit in, which is essentially just an unrestricted CDI from Molossi, and it just doesn't make a difference. I'm sorry if that hurts people's feelings, but it just doesn't make a difference. The only time with a Piaggio engine that you need to change the electrical system in terms of rev limit is if you're running a Bridgeport cylinder kit. A cylinder kit that's actually capable of exceeding this 11,000 RPM. I know, because we've run it both ways with both different cylinder setups. A Bridgeport cylinder kit with a decent exhaust needs an unrestricted CDI. An MHR replica just does not. Now, that doesn't stop you from putting one in. There's just going to be no performance benefit. Now, this does change a little bit if you want to put an in-rotor ignition on. Now, an in-rotor is a race part. There's just no two ways about it. But you can put it on a non-race engine and see a really significant performance increase. So the Molossi in-rotor that I have in this doesn't almost matter what bike you put this in, it will make a massive difference to the initial takeoff. Even if you put it in a factory 50 with no other performance increases, you're going to see a massive increase in that initial acceleration, because it's reducing the rotational mass of the flywheel, meaning the bike, essentially it's like you've taken the ball and chains off its ankles. It can now rev up as fast as it wants to. Now, you see the most performance increase with this on a Bridgeport cylinder kit, but you're still going to see a significant performance increase with basically any other setup. Would I recommend running it? It depends what you're trying to do. So the Molossi in-rotor doesn't provide any power to your lighting, and it doesn't provide any charge to your battery. So you're going to have to run a charger, and you need to work out some alternate solution for powering your lighting. Now, that's not particularly hard. We've done videos on this before, but having to continually charge your battery up, I know from experience, is a bit of a pain. So you're just going to have to balance it up, the performance advantage versus the inconvenience on a bike that you're going to be riding every day. Now, coming to the transmission, there's a couple of different options here. The best option is always going to be a Molossi overrange transmission, but it comes down to budget as well. So with this particular setup, you don't need an overrange transmission in the same way that you do if you're running a full race setup. You can very much get away with either a factory setup, just with some tuning, perhaps a stiffer contra spring or torque spring, some stiffer clutch springs and some lighter rollers. You'll very much get away with that with this particular setup. Now, if you put a Molossi, say a Multivar 2000 in, you're going to see a lot more tunability, a lot more smooth linear acceleration. And then obviously if you put the overrange transmission in, you're just going to see a benefit everywhere because they are such a good setup. So in terms of best performance, I would always recommend the overrange transmission. In terms of budget, well, you're just going to have to make your own mind up on that, because with this particular setup, you can kind of run whatever you want. There's definitely enough tunability in the factory transmission in terms of the componentry, the variator, the belt, the torque driver, the clutch and clutch bell, that you can get away with just tuning these factory parts and the bike will still run really well. Now, coming to chassis tuning, as I mentioned earlier, this is kind of not really a race or road scenario. It's really more just the more money you spend, the better the part's going to be. So instead of doing a specific race and then road beast mode setup, I think what will probably work better for this is we go one option at a time, one component at a time, and we go for the absolute best option available, and then what I think is probably the best budget option. It's probably going to make a lot more sense as it pertains to chassis tuning. Now we'll start off with tyres, which I feel are honestly the single most important part of chassis/body tuning, because they're the part that connects you to the road. If you have bad tyres, you're going to have a bad experience on the road. Now, the tyres that I've chosen on my personal bike, I feel they're probably the best option that are available for the Zip, are the Sava Mitas MC35S. Now, there's a couple of reasons why I think these are the best tyre. The first one is the actual compound and the tread pattern. So this is the closest thing to a slick tyre that you can run legally on the road. They still have a tread pattern in them, but they're what I'd call a semi-slick. The rubber compound in them as well is incredibly soft, but also I honestly find it to be really consistent and reliable. When the tyre's cold, it's got plenty of grip. When the tyre's hot, it's got plenty of grip. And when you get it really hot, it doesn't tend to beat up and sort of fall apart and feather like a lot of other non-race oriented tyres can have a habit of doing. They just work really well. They're very confidence inspiring. The second thing that I think makes these really great sort of has less to do with the tyre itself, but more to do with the size. So Sava Mitas in the MC35S don't actually sell an exact size copy of the factory tyre. I'm running different sizes on this, pretty significantly different from the factory. The main difference is these tyres with the rear is less wide and taller, and with the front is actually just a lot taller than the factory. The reason for this, running a taller or a larger circumference wheel tends to give you more stability on the road, but running a narrower tyre tends to make the bike turn into corners with a lot more agility, a lot easier and nicer to turn into corners. So I find that this particular sizing is much better overall on the road. I find, having ridden many, many Zips, being a very detail-oriented person, these tend to give the best overall stability on the road without sacrificing that comfortability and ease of just turning into the corner. It's like the bike just wants it. It just wants to steer into the corner. It's difficult to describe, but these tyres I've found give me the best on-road experience of the many hundreds of Zips that I've ridden with all different tyre options over the years. The other great thing is they're not particularly expensive. Your Pirelli, your Michelin, even V-Rubber, alternate options, even Metzler, they're not significantly cheaper than these. They're sort of bang for buck. These are just the best tyre. Honestly, I can't think of another tyre that I would recommend for these bikes. Now, if you're doing maybe a lot of wet weather riding, maybe you would go for like a Michelin City Grip on the rear. I think they make one for the front as well. There's some other good Pirelli options. They're kind of all much of a muchness. I would still honestly go for the MC35S. I really think these are just the best tyres for the Zip, and there's really not much of a price difference between these and the next best option. Now, coming to brakes, on the rear, you really don't have a lot of options. So I'm running the Belossi or the MHR brake shoes in this at the moment, and they're honestly really great. I'd say the big advantage of them is, A, they have just more power, but they have more feel too. My understanding is that the compound on the shoes is like a sintered compound, similar to what you get in like race pads as well. It tends to give you more progression in the braking. So I find the factory brakes in these generally have one of two issues, and it's sort of funny because they're opposite issues. They either tend to just be really ineffective and like almost not work, which I think generally happens because the shoe material gets old and it goes hard and it just doesn't have much bite about it anymore. Or the opposite issue, where it's just, as you're pulling the lever in, it's just nothing locked up, which is dangerous and not good on the road, not good for performance. When you're trying to get comfortable with the limits of your bike, it's not confidence inspiring at all. You almost don't even want to use it for things like drag braking and then that sort of thing, which when you're trying to find the limits of your bike and get comfortable with them is not good. So with the MHR shoes, it's a totally different experience. You have a lot of progression, they're very predictable. The progression, you've got a lot of room between nothing and locked up, but certainly if you want to lock it up, you can very much do that quite easily. So they're much more predictable, much more confidence inspiring. You feel like you know how much you pull the lever in is going to be reliably how much braking you get in a predictable sense. You get a sense of how much you can push it before you're going to get a lock up, basically. So highly recommend the Malossi rear shoe. Honestly, don't really have any experience with any of the other brake options that any of the other brands have. This just works so well, and again, they're all much of a muchness in terms of price. It's actually even pretty similar to the price of just factory shoes. So there's no reason, in my opinion, why you would use anything other than just the MHR shoes that are available for these. Now coming to the front brakes, it's a little bit of a different story. So on this bike, I've got the Malossi MHR brake pads. Honestly, everything that I said about the rear shoes is also true of the front pads. There's a massive difference in feel, massive increase in just actual braking capacity, a lot more progression, as in like room from 0% braking to full braking. They have much better feel, cold, hot, everything about them is just better. Now there's a couple of different options between the Malossi MHR pads. There's the black ones, which are like your full homologated road set. Then you've got the red racing ones and also the sort of coppery coloured scented ones. They're kind of much of a muchness. You're not getting pulled over by the police and having your front brake pads checked for homologation. So my thinking would be you just go for the best pads that you can, either the red or the scented set. I have the sort of coppery coloured scented set in this bike. They're fantastic. Massive difference from factory, and they're pretty similar price to the factory as well. They're very inexpensive. So honestly, it's one of the first upgrades that I would make to a Zip if I bought a new one, because it just makes a huge difference. Now, if you want more performance than that, going up from there, you've got a couple of options. So Polini, my understanding, and I think Stage 6 as well, do like a larger caliper for the Zip. Fits the Zip SP as well as the normal Zip. Now the big difference in terms of the front end, which we'll get to in a second with the suspension as well, because this is kind of all going to tie into one. The Zip SP uses a single swing arm setup, similar to the Vespa, whereas the air-cooled Zip uses just a conventional setup like this. The big difference is the standard air-cooled Zip has a 175mm front disc, and there's really not a lot of space between the caliper and the wheel. Compare that to the Zip SP with its single swing arm setup. There's a bit more space between the caliper and the wheel, but it also has a larger disc. It has a 200mm disc. So if you really wanted to do a really big upgrade, and I've priced it up before for myself, you could do the single swing arm conversion upgrade. My understanding is the size of the tube in the chassis, the steering bolts through is the same size between the SP and the normal Zip, or what I would call the normal Zip, the Australian Zip with the normal conventional shocks. So you can do a single swing arm upgrade where you literally just bolt the single swing arm up through the bike and you convert it to the similar system to the Vespa. Now this, a couple of big differences. This goes from, if you were just to buy all the actual SP parts, this goes from being a Chinese Hengtong caliper up to the proper Italian-made caliper. You have a larger disc as well. And then in terms of the suspension, which we'll get to in a second, it gives you the ability to interchange the shock, because it's an actual normal shock absorber that bolts into the swing arm as opposed to just being forks. So you can interchange, you can unbolt the shock and bolt in different options. I'll get to that in a second. But with the braking, it gives you more capability because you've got a larger disc, but now you've got more space between the caliper and the wheel, so you've got more options for larger calipers. So with a short wheelbase bike like this, you're going to hit the bike's maximum braking capability pretty quickly, because it's going to get to a point quite quickly the bike's just going to literally want to do a big endo and flip. So with the Zip SP, I honestly feel like if you were to do the single swing arm conversion and then put some better pads in, that's probably going to have you pretty close to the limit. But if you really want to push it, you can then do the caliper upgrade, which has a 4-pot caliper, which is going to be like double the effectiveness of this 2-pot caliper. I'd done a similar conversion before in an SR50 that I had, stage 6 at the time, did an oversized disc and a 4-pot caliper upgrade, which I did to my bike, and it was ridiculous. It was honestly too much. It was uncomfortable how much braking it had. Similar thing, it kind of got to the bike's natural ability. If you just grabbed a whole handful of brake, you do an endo and flip. So if you're not a mega confident rider, I was pretty confident, but if you're not a mega confident rider, it would be a little bit uneasy feeling. So I honestly feel that if you want to go for the cheap option, just put better pads in. This is probably going to be where most people are at. If you're building a race bike and you're just going to reach the capacity of the brakes, then I would recommend going for the single swing arm setup, because then you have a bigger disc, but you also have more ability to upgrade the caliper as well. Right, staying at the front, but moving up to suspension upgrades. Now, as I touched on, there's not really much you can do to these forks to get a lot of performance out of them. You can change the fluid in them. That's going to make a slight difference to the dampening. I honestly wouldn't have too much complaint about how they are from factory. They do tend to dive a little bit under heavy braking, but changing the fluid is not really going to change that. It's just going to increase the dampening over bumps. The other thing you can do is you could perhaps track down some stiffer springs, or you can space out the springs a bit more. That's going to give you more stiffness. But I suspect that's going to make the bike just feel a bit uneasy and uncomfortable on the road. We've done this upgrade to an Aprilia Sport City before, which has a similar fork setup, where we put some spacers in and stiffened the front springs, and it didn't feel nice. It was not a comfortable upgrade, so I probably wouldn't recommend it. What I would recommend is, if you really wanted to go to that next level, you're going to go up to the single swing arm upgrade, which is going to give you obviously all the braking capability upgrades that we already talked about. But the single swing arm has the ability, as I mentioned, to unbolt the shock and bolt in a new shock. This is a bit of a game changer, because you've got a lot more options. So you could go, for instance, for one of the YSS, I've forgotten what they're called, but one of the sort of factory performance upgrade shocks. They're like a black in color. I've got one of them in the rear of this, which we'll get to in a second. But these shocks are like a couple $100. So it's a big expense for the single swing arm, but then you can put one of these YSS shocks in, and it's going to make a really big difference. And it gives you some tunability as well, because it's got the little click setting stiffness adjustments in the spring. So you've got more damping, but you've got a lot more adjustment in the spring as well. So it's going to be a massive advantage straight away. But if you're doing racing and you really want to take it to sort of the nth degree in terms of level, you can put a Malossi or a Paoli or stage 6. There's so many different options of shock that you can bolt in there. You can spend a ridiculous amount if you want to, and have a full race level performance front end setup. Really, the key is that single swing arm conversion. It gives you all the adjustability. Now, it is a big upgrade. You've got to buy the steering stem, you've got to buy all the componentry in that swing arm, including the bushes and the bearings and all of that, which you need to maintain as well. You need to buy a different wheel as well. You need to buy, obviously, the disc and the caliper that go along with that. From memory, there's some additional brackets and things that need to go along with the caliper. It's a really big upgrade. It's probably going to cost you a couple $1,000. But if you want to take it to the next level, it's kind of your only option. Now, coming to the rear, you probably can't see it real well from there, but I've got it's the Pro X, it's called, the YSS Pro X, which is like their entry-level performance shock. And that's what I've got in the rear of this. The factory, like I said, the forks aren't too bad from factory. They dive a little bit, but they're not too bad. The factory shock in the rear of these is disgusting. Even from factory, like brand new, they're pretty poor. But then with time, they are classic for the seal disintegrating and leaking all the gas and the oil out, and they just turn into a big, bouncy, terrible mess in the rear end. So putting even just this YSS Pro X shock in makes a massive difference. We've used these shocks for years. They're really great. I've had this shock for a few years. We've had customers that have had them for way longer than that, and they hold up. They really hold up. They've got a little bit of adjustment, just enough, well and truly enough for most people. Even if you were racing, I honestly think you'd get away with one of these. So they're a great upgrade. Obviously, Malossi, Stage 6, all the usual culprits, they have a bunch of different options for the rear. The rear shock is the same as the SP, so they want to make all the racing parts for all the racing scooters. So you can get all of those parts for the rear shock in this. Rear shock makes a big difference because under braking, you're talking mostly about the front, but for your general riding, most of your weight is sitting on this rear end. So even just doing the upgrade to the rear, honestly makes a big difference. That's all I've done, and I'm really happy with the handling of this scooter. It's a short wheelbase little scooter. It's never going to be, like an Aprilia RSV4 in terms of handling. It's always going to be a bit of a bucket of crap, no matter what you do to it. But it'll be passable, and putting just this YSS shock in the rear honestly makes it that much better. But if you want to go to the next level, you can spend all the money in the world, and it will obviously be better. The other thing with the rear shock is suspension risers. I don't like these. I don't like the way they feel, especially on a short wheelbase bike. I had one on this, a Polini one. It makes the front feel uncomfortable and uneasy because it changes the rake angle. So the rake angle is how angled your forks are. So when you lift the rear, it sort of straightens up the rake angle, and I don't like the way that feels. I think it feels really uncomfortable and twitchy and unpredictable in the front. Some people do like that. I'm really particular, so I notice it really badly. I got this scooter from a friend of mine. He had that riser in there. I had it in for a little bit and then I took it out, and it was so much better as soon as I took it out. So I guess it's a preference thing. I just don't like that twitchy feeling in the front. Now there are a couple of advantages to putting the block in the back. Handling, I don't think, is one of them, apart from if you're having a lot of trouble keeping the front wheel down. It sort of angles the bike down, so it sort of prevents it from wanting to pop the front wheel all the time. But the other advantages are it can be a real pain working on particularly the carb and the air filter on these, getting access to inside here. When you put a suspension riser in, it lifts the back of the bike up away from the engine casing, which gives you a lot more workable space inside here. Now, I still don't think it's worth it. On other bikes like the SR50, it's a bit more passable, I think. But you've got a lot more working room inside them anyway. So again, I guess it's a preference thing. And when it comes to things like body upgrades, there are quite actually a lot of options for the Zip. Now, one of the best ones is the Zip SP sort of panel kit upgrade, particularly the front cover. The Zip SP front cover looks so much better than this one. I've actually got one at home. It's probably next on the list for this. I'm going to do a bit of body work to it, respray it, do a bunch of stuff. But point is that there are a lot of options for the Zip. Because they're such a popular scooter to tune, all the performance manufacturers know that if they make parts, they're going to sell. So there's all sorts of cool things, different lights, there's different headlights, there's lots and lots of options. It's next thing on the list for this bike, now that I've actually got it running properly. So, get it sort of looking the part. There are a couple of frustrating things. Obviously, textured plastics on scooters, they hate sun. They always deteriorate really badly and crumble apart. Now, fortunately, most of the textured stuff, even just from Piaggio, if you buy brand new replacement parts, tends to be generally pretty cheap. So getting the brand new replacement parts is a pretty good option. You're just going to have to keep the bike out of the sun because they will fade terribly with sunlight. Other options, if you're pretty handy with a rattle gun or, like a rattle can of paint or even a spray gun, you can Raptor coat them. I've had customers that have done that before. Now, the prep work is really key here because if you don't use the correct primer, like etch primer or plastic primer, or even with those correct primers, it can flake off them really badly. Paint doesn't generally like to stick to textured plastic. So the big key there is doing the prep work, and I would definitely recommend removing the panels from the bike to spray them and then being really careful when you put them back on that you don't scuff the paint up. But Raptor generally tends to be pretty good stuff. U-Pole is a really reputable brand who makes Raptor, and all of their paints tend to be really, really good. Now, other upgrades that I would recommend in terms of color and paint body-wise, I know because I've been looking into it recently. Obviously, painting your front silver forks, you can't really see them in the shop, but they look terrible. So you can paint them in like a GMH is a good product to use, but just any good reputable brand rattle can is going to be mostly okay. Ideally, you'd two-pack them, but it depends on what you're comfortable with and what sort of resources you have access to. Another really excellent product is a company called Eastwood. They make a high heat, flame-proof two-pack paint that comes in a rattle can. So it has a little valve at the bottom of it that you press. It releases the hardener into the paint. Now, 2-pack is a much better product than just your normal 1K, think of spray paint in a can. That's what they call a 1K paint. It just is paint and thinners, and you spray it on and the thinners evaporates and it goes off. But it's not a very durable product, whereas 2-pack has a paint and then a hardener, and they actually react with each other. It's a much higher quality paint. It's what car paint is. So Eastwood make this really good flame-proof 2K paint. So with the valve, you release the hardener, you shake it up, and you've got about an hour of working time before it starts to go off. Now, this is direct to metal paint, which means you can paint your engine with it. So you can take your engine out, clean it up, do the prep work, mask up the areas that you don't want the paint to get on, spray it, and they do it in a gloss and a matte or a satin black color, and it looks fantastic. I've spray painted an engine casing, a motorcycle engine casing, like an old bike. I did a bit of a resto too, and man, it looks so good. And the stuff was so tough, so excellent for something like this. You can black out your engine. Also stops, the aluminium casings tend to sort of pit with time. They oxidize, they get that gross white pitting all over them, and they start to just look like rubbish. This paint will seal the aluminium and it will stop that from happening. So your bike, after a quick hose off, will look brand new again, at least the engine will. And you can use it on all your engine covers as well, your transmission cover. To be honest, one can would probably do your whole engine, your transmission cover, and your forks, if you were clever about it, and you had everything prepped up well in advance. So highly recommend that particular product if you want to do a bit of body work and paint upgrades to your scooter. Anyway, hopefully you got something usable out of that. As you can probably tell if you've gotten to this point of the video, I'm a pretty detail-oriented person and I absolutely love Piaggio Zips. So if that was you and you got something usable out of that, go ahead and help us out by hitting the like button. And if you've got any questions, as always, please let us know. We endeavor to answer every single comment. And if you haven't already, obviously go ahead and hit the sub button because we have quite a few more things to do to this, my personal scooter. And we also have a new project scooter coming up quite shortly as well. So you definitely won't want to miss that. Anyway, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.